First of all, I just want to start by saying anytime you're asked to return to a place that you helped build, you had a hand in building, it's special.
Nobody saw the ultimate betrayal coming until the ink was already dry on the contract, completely flipping the power dynamics inside the league. The Indiana Fever had just completed one of the most historic, record-demolishing seasons in the entire history of women's professional basketball, pulling a chronically underperforming franchise out of the shadows and back into the playoff conversation where they once proudly belonged. Fans were absolutely electric. The jerseys were selling at numbers nobody had ever witnessed before. And it genuinely felt like the organization had finally discovered its long-term identity after years of painful irrelevance and gut-wrenching lottery disappointment. The young core was building undeniable on-court chemistry. The offensive system was beginning to fire on all cylinders, and the city of Indianapolis had completely wrapped its arms around this brand-new era of basketball. But behind closed doors, shielded from the roaring crowds and the overwhelmingly positive media coverage, a massive storm was quietly building. One that would completely dismantle the roster, shatter the carefully constructed image of a perfectly unified locker room, and push the team's biggest star into an incredibly uncomfortable, pressure-filled new reality. Just when absolutely everyone believed the exhausting drama of the rookie season was safely buried in the rearview mirror and the team could finally breathe, the front office detonated a sudden bombshell that sent violent shockwaves rippling across the entire sports universe. Christy Sides, the head coach who had survived an unimaginable media firestorm, absorbed the harshest criticism without flinching, and ultimately steered the franchise to their first postseason appearance in nearly a decade, was coldly and unceremoniously shown the exit door. It was a ruthless, calculated business move that sent a crystal-clear message. The organization was no longer content with simply showing up. They were coming to conquer. But the real earthquake didn't register when Sides got fired. It registered the moment the front office proudly unveiled her deeply controversial replacement. In her place, the franchise boldly announced the arrival of a name that instantly made die-hard Fever fans' blood run hot and triggered a deafening, impossible-to-ignore silence from the team's most important player. They had gone out and brought in Stephanie White, the brilliant but ruthlessly demanding defensive architect who had spent the last several months engineering a brutal, physically punishing, and relentlessly aggressive campaign specifically designed to neutralize Caitlin Clark. This wasn't simply a routine coaching change meant to adjust a few offensive sets. To many people inside that building, it felt dangerously close to inviting the wolf directly into the henhouse. Stephanie White was the head coach of the Connecticut Sun, the exact same franchise that had spent the entire season serving as the undisputed villain in the Fever's story. As the explosive news spread like wildfire across social media platforms and major sports networks, the newly installed president of basketball operations, Kelly Krauskopf, found herself immediately working overtime to contain a rapidly escalating internal crisis. Krauskopf had to move fast, ultimately being forced to expose the uncomfortable truth behind Caitlin Clark's deepest reservations about her new head coach before the unchecked rumors could rip the locker room wide open. But that wasn't even the complete picture because the toxic seeds of this incredibly awkward dynamic had actually been planted months before anyone inside or outside the building had any idea a leadership overhaul was even on the table. Stretching all the way back to the very first time these two opposing forces collided on a professional basketball floor. To fully grasp the enormous weight and danger of this unfolding situation, you have to look closely at exactly what happened throughout Caitlin's punishing rookie campaign, specifically when she went war with White's suffocating defensive system. The jump from college basketball to the professional level is notoriously difficult for any player, but what this particular young superstar was forced to endure was genuinely unprecedented in the entire history of the sport. Opposing teams didn't simply play tough traditional defense against her. They launched a systematic, highly coordinated campaign of physical intimidation specifically designed to locate and destroy her breaking point. It was a true baptism by fire, loaded with dirty plays away from the ball, brutally hard screens engineered to leave marks, and borderline flagrant fouls that dominated national headlines week after painful week. And absolutely no team in the entire league embodied this aggressive, deliberately hostile blueprint more devastatingly than the Connecticut Sun. Under the direct, completely unapologetic leadership of Stephanie White, the Sun transformed themselves into a suffocating defensive machine that appeared to take genuine satisfaction in making the rookie's professional life a daily nightmare on the hardwood. White engineered elaborate defensive traps designed to strip the ball from Clark's hands, deploying smothering full-court pressure that drained the young guard physically and mentally before she could even advance past half-court. Every single time the Fever squared off against Connecticut, it was far less of a traditional basketball competition and far more of a grinding, suffocating heavyweight street fight. The absolute peak of this institutional hostility, the singular moment that permanently fractured the relationship between these two franchises, arrived during the opening round of the enormously anticipated playoffs, a series that will remain forever scorched into the memory of every furious Indiana fan. During that unbearably tense playoff series, the physical aggression reached a flashpoint that sent social media into a full-blown meltdown. In a deeply controversial, endlessly debated moment that fundamentally altered the mood of the entire postseason, Connecticut's DeWanna Bonner Carrington jabbed a finger directly into Caitlin's eye. A vicious play that somehow escaped the referees entirely and left the rookie visibly rattled, in visible pain, and struggling to maintain her vision. The glaring absence of official protection was one deeply infuriating layer, but the broader narrative that crystallized from that entire series was completely impossible to ignore. Stephanie White's team was absolutely prepared to test every boundary the rulebook offered to permanently break the rookie's competitive spirit. They cornered her, they physically bullied her in the paint, they swarmed her relentlessly on the perimeter, and they ultimately brought her extraordinary rookie season to a crushing and devastating end. For the Indiana front office to turn right back around just a few short weeks later, dismiss their own head coach, and hand the complete keys of the entire franchise over to the exact same woman who personally orchestrated that very nightmare was a jaw-dropping plot twist that absolutely nobody had seen coming. It felt like a thunderous, deliberate slap directly across the face of a player who had just poured every last drop of her physical and mental energy into elevating this franchise from irrelevance. And what happened next would leave the entire basketball world completely stunned. As the cold, unforgiving reality of this front office decision began slowly sinking in inside the heavily secured Fever practice facility, the total silence from the franchise player in the immediate hours following the hiring announcement was nothing short of ear-splitting. And it didn't take very long at all for the real, deeply buried issues to begin leaking out to trusted league insiders. Kelly Krauskopf didn't fight her way back to the front office after her successful stint with the NBA's Pacers organization simply to shake hands, make friends, or preserve the comfortable status quo. She returned with one singular burning mission: to construct a genuine dynasty, and she understood immediately that she had a massive, raging organizational fire that needed to be extinguished right now. Through a series of intense, carefully guarded behind-the-scenes conversations, Krauskopf uncovered the brutal and completely unavoidable truth at the heart of the situation. Caitlin's deepest problem with Stephanie White wasn't simply about the relentless physical punishment she absorbed throughout the playoffs, although that deliberate eye poke had certainly left behind a profoundly bitter aftertaste that wasn't going to dissolve overnight. The real foundational issue was a deep-seated absence of trust and a terrifying, unresolved question of loyalty that was fully capable of derailing the entire upcoming season before a single tip-off ever took place. Throughout the entire previous season, the young superstar had felt chronically unprotected, profoundly isolated, and completely abandoned out on that floor by her previous head coach. When she was being violently thrown to the hardwood, unfairly targeted by rival players carrying obvious personal vendettas, and savagely attacked in hostile press conference environments, she almost never witnessed Christie sides absorbing a massive fine, slamming her fist on a table in righteous fury, or genuinely going to war on her behalf in front of the media. Sides consistently chose to play the carefully measured role of the diplomat, repeatedly instructing her team to tune out the outside noise and simply play through the relentless physical contact. But that fundamentally passive approach quietly and deeply alienated the franchise's most important player. And now that same superstar was being asked to place her complete faith and trust in a brand new coach whose entire professional identity and hard-earned reputation inside this fiercely competitive league had been built entirely on defensive brutality. The exact same brand of ruthless, calculated brutality that had just been deployed as a weapon specifically designed to terrorize her. Krauskopf immediately recognized that if she failed to step in without hesitation, if she allowed these deep-rooted resentments to quietly fester in the shadows of the practice facility, the locker room would completely implode long before training camp ever opened its doors. She had no choice but to take bold, sweeping action, personally facilitating raw, completely unfiltered, emotionally charged conversations between the young phenom and the veteran head coach, forcing both of them to sit across from each other and confront the enormous elephant dominating the room directly and honestly. The president of basketball operations had to look her franchise star square in the eyes and deliver an ironclad personal guarantee that the very same ruthlessness White had unleashed against her in those brutal playoffs would now be entirely redirected and weaponized with singular purpose: to shield and protect her at all costs. It was an enormous psychological mountain to scale, and persuading a fiercely competitive, deeply headstrong player to willingly place her blind trust in the hands of the woman who had been her greatest professional tormentor was a breathtakingly delicate, high-wire act of genuinely historic proportions. White was required to lay her complete tactical philosophy completely bare, demonstrating convincingly that the savage defensive assault was never personal, but was instead the ultimate professional acknowledgement of just how genuinely threatening and dangerous the rookie was every single time she stepped between the lines. But clearing away the stubborn remnants of that toxic bad blood and those deep, lingering emotional wounds was only the very outermost tip of a massive iceberg when it came to their inevitable, enormously anticipated collision on the basketball court. Because once the emotional barriers were carefully dismantled, they still faced the enormous practical challenge of figuring out how to actually play winning basketball together without pushing each other directly over the edge. Basketball analysts and deeply experienced tactical experts immediately zeroed in on a potentially catastrophic strategic crisis looming dangerously on the horizon, one that posed a very serious threat to completely unravel the team's offensive identity if it wasn't managed with extraordinary precision and care. You don't need an advanced basketball degree or decades of scouting experience to clearly recognize that Caitlin's natural style of play is gloriously unpredictable, deeply rooted in pure instinct and feel, and constructed entirely around pushing the pace of the game to its absolute outer boundaries. Her entire offensive worldview is centered around launching soaring deep transition threes before the opposing defense can even begin to organize, firing high-risk, impossibly precise passes through the tightest of windows, and transforming every single game into a breathless, relentless, lung-burning track meet. It is a wildly entertaining system engineered on total freedom, fearless creative expression, and a willingness to absorb a few painful turnovers in exchange for explosive, momentum-stealing offensive eruptions that psychologically crush and demoralize the opposition. Stephanie White, on the exact and complete opposite end of the strategic universe, operates from an entirely different philosophical galaxy. During her remarkably effective tenure running the Connecticut program, she constructed a disciplined, heavily regimented half-court grit and grind operation. She demanded absolute, uncompromising defensive accountability on every single possession, deliberately choked the game's pace down to a suffocating, thick crawl, and placed enormous strategic priority on physical interior play over flashy, up-tempo perimeter basketball. Attempting to forcibly merge these two utterly contrasting basketball philosophies into one cohesive, functioning system is the precise equivalent of trying to violently blend oil and water in the middle of a Category 5 hurricane. The very real and deeply terrifying fear circulating inside the organization is that White will instinctively reach for the restrictive leash when managing her young superstar, compelling her to grind through rigid, painfully slow half-court offensive sets that completely smother her generational gifts and quietly reduce one of the most electric players on the planet into just another ordinary, forgettable point guard. If White attempts to aggressively micromanage every single offensive possession from the sideline and systematically strips away the liberating freedom that transformed the rookie into a genuine global phenomenon overnight, the simmering underlying tension will absolutely detonate into a full-blown, devastatingly public feud that the hungry media will devour with pure, shameless delight. Krauskopf had no choice but to plant both of these remarkably stubborn, iron-willed women in the same room and skillfully broker a sweeping, high-stakes compromise, bluntly demanding that White dramatically evolve her deeply entrenched, old-school coaching philosophy to genuinely honor the unique strengths spread across this roster, while simultaneously challenging her young superstar to finally fully commit to a significantly more demanding, exhausting, and disciplined defensive standard. It is an extraordinarily fragile, precariously balanced compromise that could shatter into 1,000 irreparable pieces the very instant a three-game losing skid arrives and the suffocating organizational pressure begins its inevitable climb. However, this rapidly approaching tactical time bomb surprisingly pales in comparison to the enormous locker room fracture that was already quietly and dangerously beginning to take shape directly beneath the front office's noses, involving other absolutely critical pieces of the championship building puzzle. While every single set of eyes in the basketball world remained firmly and obsessively locked onto the riveting, deeply combustible dynamic between the franchise star and the brand new head coach, the remainder of the roster was silently absorbing every detail of the unfolding drama from the sidelines. And the personal stakes riding on the outcome for each of them could not possibly be any more enormous or consequential. The Indiana Fever are emphatically not a one-woman basketball franchise, And the single most catastrophic nightmare scenario haunting Krauskopf every night is presiding over the creation of a deeply splintered locker room where players are silently pressured into choosing sides in a quiet, slow-burning civil war. Aaliyah Boston, a genuinely elite post player and a former #1 overall draft selection in her own distinguished right, had just begun discovering a richly productive and highly devastating rhythm operating within the pick-and-roll action during the second half of the previous season. She desperately requires a completely stable, entirely drama-free organizational environment to sustain and build upon that impressive upward trajectory. Not a destabilizing power struggle between the perimeter talent and the coaching staff constantly raging in the background. Beyond that, the situation surrounding Nalissa Smith had grown increasingly complicated and murky, with a string of cryptic and pointed social media activity and unmistakable visible dissatisfaction over her shrinking role in the rotation loudly hinting at a deeply fractured relationship with the broader organization. White somehow has to repair these splintered internal relationships, solve the enormously complex front-court rotation equation, and simultaneously keep every single player mentally locked in and fully invested in the collective system. But the single most terrifying domino positioned to collapse in this entire sprawling, chaotic saga remains the breathtakingly high-stakes impending free agency situation surrounding Kelsey Mitchell. A situation that carries the very real power to single-handedly define or completely destroy this franchise's entire future in the blink of an eye. Mitchell is the undisputed veteran heartbeat and emotional engine of the offense, a devastatingly lethal and explosively fast scoring weapon who wholeheartedly and enthusiastically embraced the new run-and-gun system throughout the previous year and proved absolutely instrumental in powering the team's remarkable late-season surge all the way into the postseason. She is currently an unrestricted free agent, meaning every ounce of negotiating leverage rests entirely in her hands, and she is watching with sharp, calculating eyes precisely how this deeply polarizing coaching transition is being managed and communicated by the front office leadership. If she detects even the faintest trace of genuine locker room dysfunction, or if the new offensive identity suddenly pivots in a direction that dramatically shrinks and marginalizes her scoring role simply to comfortably accommodate the incoming coach's defense-first, post-heavy strategic preferences, she possesses every conceivable reason to pack her belongings, walk out the door, and ink a lucrative contract with a battle-tested championship contender. Losing Mitchell to unrestricted free agency without receiving a single asset in return would represent a complete and utterly catastrophic organizational failure for the front office, brutally setting the entire franchise back by multiple developmental years and instantly igniting the notoriously passionate and unforgiving fan base in furious opposition to the brand new regime. Krauskopf understands with crystal clarity that successfully maintaining the delicate, constantly shifting piece between her franchise point guard and her controversial new head coach isn't merely about capturing a handful of additional regular season victories. It is about sending an unambiguous, resounding declaration to every corner of the league that Indiana is a genuinely stable, elite-level professional destination, not a deeply dysfunctional, mismanaged traveling circus. White has to stride confidently into that locker room on the very first day and immediately seize commanding, unquestioned respect without simultaneously alienating the exact group of fiercely loyal players who just bled, sacrificed, and fought alongside one another to finally claw their way back to the postseason. But managing the delicate emotional sensitivities of the players behind closed doors is essentially child's play when measured directly against the towering, unrelenting media inferno that sits waiting and hungry just beyond the arena walls. The modern WNBA media landscape has undergone a dramatic and turbulent transformation into an extraordinarily volatile, deeply corrosive environment that devours any sign of weakness or organizational dysfunction with breathtaking speed. Successfully navigating it demands an elite level of political intelligence and masterful public relations instincts that the previous coaching staff simply never came close to possessing. Every single sentence spoken aloud at a press conference podium, every minor rotation adjustment made during a routine second-quarter stretch, and every barely perceptible sideline eye roll captured by a courtside television camera is instantly scrutinized, viciously extracted from all context, and furiously debated across millions of outrage-fueled social media timelines. During the franchise player's enormously publicized and heavily scrutinized debut season, the surrounding media circus was suffocatingly relentless and profoundly draining for every single person connected to the organization. Rival players were routinely launching blatant, deeply personal verbal attacks from press conference podiums. Former legends of the game were lining up to offer completely unsolicited and harshly critical public assessments, and the dominant narrative relentlessly drifted away from actual basketball and strayed into the turbulent waters of controversy, racial politics, and deeply divisive social discourse. Christie's sides far too often resembled a completely paralyzed deer frozen in the glare of oncoming headlights whenever she was forced to stand in front of a microphone following a difficult and emotional defeat, chronically failing to effectively shape or control the surrounding narrative and perpetually leaving her players completely defenseless and fully exposed to the most vicious and unrelenting of the media wolves circling outside. This is precisely where the ultimate, most definitive verdict on Stephanie White's fiercely contested hiring will ultimately be rendered by both the front office leadership and the intensely watchful fan base. Krauskopf deliberately and specifically brought White back home to Indiana because she carries a firmly established, widely respected reputation for being ferociously protective of every player under her care and completely, utterly unshakable under even the most suffocating and intense media scrutiny imaginable. When White was forcefully and publicly defending the relentlessly physical, borderline reckless style of play her Connecticut roster employed throughout the previous season, she executed it with a calm, quietly menacing, iron-fisted confidence that immediately silenced even the most aggressive and confrontational reporters in the room while constructing an impenetrable protective shield around her entire locker room. Now, she is being directly and explicitly charged with channeling that identical fierce, completely uncompromising, battle-hardened energy.